Oh, hello everyone, and it was very nice to meet some of you yesterday and begin to talk about some of the themes that I'm hoping to touch on this morning. I've sort of think the theme that's been set in Dialogue with History, Memory and Culture is a really interesting one, so I've tried to stick to the subject matter. But first, just a few words about BDP. I'm a principal, an architect principal of BDP, Building Design Partnership in London, but we have studios across the world, and probably one of the most distinguishing features of BDP is that we've always been multidisciplinary, so we've always been a collective of architects, engineers and all the professions connected with construction. We were founded in the 1930s by somebody called George Grenfell Baines, who I always think looks like Frank Lloyd Wright. In fact, he's even photographed as if he's Frank Lloyd Wright. And apparently he met Walter Gropius at some point, maybe in the late 50s, early 60s. And he was very proud of the fact that Gropius, the founder of the Bauhaus, or the first president of the Bauhaus, said to him, "What you've done in practice is what I've always wanted to do, to create a multidisciplinary design practice." And we have studios around the United Kingdom and Ireland, and we always have. We've always been quite a large firm, so we're about 1,300 people now. But we also have studios across the world, including a brand new studio in New York. So if any of you are looking for work and want to move to New York, there may be a job for you. The kind of work we do really is very broad-ranging, from some very iconic projects. You probably recognise Wimbledon on the right there, the lawn tennis club, where we did the master plan and the big number one stadium and players' facilities. This is a science centre in Scotland, a lot of universities, a lot of public sector work where there's a big component of participation, and that's another theme this morning that I'm going to come back to, engaging with users. This is a project for the University of Cambridge, a faculty of education that I worked on about 20 years ago now. And the Faculty of Education in Urbino is actually a building I'm going to return to too. We go from very small to really very large. This was the project for the regeneration of the centre of Liverpool in northern England, which won lots of prizes in its day. And at the moment, our largest project is the project for the restoration and renewal of the Houses of Parliament in London. So it's obviously a building of immense historic importance, and we're on a very long-term project to, in a sense, very much in the sense that De Carlo would understand, to replan the building, to restore it, but also change it within this listed fabric, this national sort of listed fabric. We do stadia, so some of these soccer facilities for the World Cup that's just about to start. And we also do a lot of large-scale projects like hospitals. This is one of mine, and I'll also be coming back to that in a moment. So why are we here today in Urbino? And maybe more importantly, why are you here today? De Carlo used to talk about Urbino and historic centres being laboratories of architecture. And I'd like to sort of make that my starting point for, so ask the question why. Why did he think, why do we still think it's worth coming here in 2022 to look at a city that's been here for a few thousand years? And De Carlo created his International Laboratory of Architecture and Urban Design. I'm sure you know, ILAUD it was called for short. And he would meet, I think this is an image of ILAUD taking place in Urbino many years ago, probably in the 1970s. And De Carlo actually standing over a model that I helped to organise the making of by a group of students back in 1993. I think part of the answer is multidimensionality, or at least that would have been De Carlo's answer, because he felt that Urbino offered a whole series of dimensions that help us to think about architecture and think about cities. And he would have said, it's a city that, of course, is very small, especially by the standards of, the kind of places that you live, San Antonio, big cities, London, and yet it somehow seems much bigger than it is, and it has a monumental quality, of course, in this image. Calvino, the Italian novelist, said of Urbino, and a palace that instead of rising within a city's walls, contains within its own walls a city, could only be Urbino. And if you haven't read Invisible Cities, from which that's a quote, I highly recommend it. So, because it's a book in which Calvino talks about 50 cities, but they're all, you discover by the end of the book, that they're all shades of the same city. So it's really just different ways of interpreting and understanding a place, a bit like the kind of things that you're doing with the models that I saw yesterday. And I think some of the qualities of Urbino that De Carlo pointed out were these dualisms, inside outside. This is the one of the windows at the top of the palace that you may have seen, where you're actually standing outside, but you're looking through the window to the outside. So it makes you pause to think. And there was the dualism between the man-made and the natural, so much so that you can't really quite make out what's town and what's countryside. There's this extraordinary kind of symbiosis there. And there's the quality of the landscape and the cityscape. You know, when you're on the School of Education there and you're standing on top of it, are you on a building or are you on the landscape? Are you actually on the hill or are you standing on a piece of architecture? Was it always there or was it something that's just been created? De Carlo would speak about collective memory, and I think in terms of the theme, history, memory, culture, this idea of the city as a repository of memories is really important. And I think what I think is lovely about De Carlo, that in coming to Urbino for over 50 years and designing here, he made certain connections across time. And one of the most sort of interesting examples is the ramp, and I'm sure you've all been up, that was completely hidden beneath a 19th century theatre that sits on top of it, until De Carlo, in a sense, rediscovered this ramp and brought it back to life, so sort of reinstating something that had always been there, but was, in a sense, he would say, part of the collective memory of the place. I think the other strand here is the connection he made with Francesco di Giorgio, who was the Renaissance architect who designed the ramp for the Duke to ride his horse all the way up to the palace. And Francesco di Giorgio in the 15th century was not only an architect, but he was acting like an engineer, designing fortifications. He was writing about architecture. He was really bringing theory and practice together in a way that I think is very much like De Carlo did. De Carlo participated in Team 10, who I'm sure you've all heard about, and we did touch on yesterday, a group of architects who were very interested in the relationship between theory and practice. They weren't actually doing, as professionals, collaborating in that sense. They were all individuals with their own practices in different countries, including Americans like Shadrach Woods, Dutch architect Aldo van Eyck, and many others, the Smithsons from England. And they would meet every year, just like you're doing, in this sort of environment to talk about architecture. And one of the sort of historical figures that they brought to light, a bit like De Carlo gave renewed emphasis to Francesco di Giorgio, was Leon Battista Alberti, the other famous contemporary of Francesco di Giorgio, who wrote a treatise on architecture, which was really given a lot of publicity by Team 10. And this phrase, plucked from his book, got a lot of airtime back in the sort of late 50s, going into the 60s and 70s. And it's something that's of great interest to me. Ever since I first read it, I thought this phrase had extraordinary resonance. If, as the philosophers maintain, the city is like a big house, and the house is in turn like a little city, cannot the various parts of the house be considered miniature buildings? And I've been so taken with this phrase that I've actually written a book about it, which should come out next year, so keep an eye out for it, Big House, Little City. But I think it's a dimension of what I'll be touching on today, a very important dimension. So the question is, why did this phrase have any meaning for them? And I think part of the answer, perhaps the answer, is the reaction against these kinds of projects. Now, this is an unbuilt project you've probably seen before by Le Corbusier for the centre of Paris, the Plan Voisin, from the 1920s. You look at it and you think, well, could this really have been a serious idea? I mean, that's the Seine. You can sort of make out the historic districts of Paris around the edges. But this was actually blasting its way through the middle. He was going to knock down a whole swathe of the centre of Paris to do this. And De Carlo called this the faith in how and the ignorance of why. So there's a kind of a belief in the machine age, on getting things done, on high density, finding a sort of new look for the architecture, a kind of big scale. This approach found expression in the Athens Charter, which was written or was prepared in the 1930s and then finally written into almost like a little Bible in the 1940s. And this became the blueprint for a lot of town planning after the war. So it was hugely influential in setting the scene for everything that came next. And part of it was the idea of zoning, functional zoning. So you get central business districts that are entirely office-based. And you can see the influence. I mean, here we are, this could be anywhere. I don't actually know where this is. I can't remember. I must have found this image on the internet. I mean, it could actually be anywhere. It really doesn't matter. It's an anywhere architecture. What De Carlo would have called the cold neutrality of technique. You don't really ask yourself why you're doing it. You just do it. The bigger, the better. More acres of floor space for offices, and it all pretty much looks the same, except every now and then there's an explosion of architecture as an art. Something a bit different, which De Carlo called the hot arrogance of art, which doesn't really make up for everything else around it. Now, what is the real point he's making here? What lies behind some of the things he was saying? And I think another key element, the companion to reading cities, participation, those two twin concepts, reading and participation. And for De Carlo, in a piece he wrote in 1971, which was very ahead of its time, I think, he wrote this phrase which I've always loved: unlike order, this order cannot be designed. Those who have tried to do so, and I think of Frank Gehry in that image you just saw, have designed a disordered order. That is another kind of order. In fact, the real point is not that of mimicking surface aspects of disorder, but of creating the conditions allowing a free expression of disorder. So what he's saying really is that if you want cities to be alive and changing and growing and designed in part through engagement with people, you need to do things differently. And De Carlo around the same time also said architecture is too important to be left to architects, which often enrages architects, thinking, well, what on earth does he mean? How arrogant of him to say this. Surely architects are really important. Well, he wasn't saying that what we do is irrelevant. He was actually saying that it's so important that we need to get buy-in from everybody else. We need the contributions of other people. Because this means if we operate in a vacuum as architects and we just do top-down planning, you get the kind of monotonous anywhere architecture that we've just seen. So one of the keys is to really think hard about how we involve people. But this idea of architecture, where's it gone?
Sorry about that.
Okay. So I was just saying that De Carlo's phrase, architecture is too important to be left to architects. You have to understand that probably in relation to this book, which came out in '64, I think, Architecture Without Architects, which was really the same theme, and it was about the vernacular and the idea that, in contrast to the international style, this anywhere architecture, the world had thousands of years of indigenous architecture in every part of the world with extraordinary character, responsiveness to climate and so on. And that just happens one of the pages in the book, which was an Italian hill town. So this work by Rudowski and the exhibition that went with it was very influential, and I think is part of the backdrop to what we're talking about. And De Carlo had already himself, in the 1950s, done an exhibition on what he called spontaneous architecture. So you can see these are, I don't know if you know the Trulli from southern Italy, from Puglia. It's a very ancient form of house. So there was extraordinary variety of architectural quality. And I think coming back to Urbino, what Riccardo was interested in is in a sense, uncovering the DNA of Urbino, the DNA that gives the quality, the architecture, its peculiar quality. And the kind of analysis that he did of Urbino, which is really blazing the trail for the kinds of things that you're looking at, were brought together in a book published in 1966, which summarized his master plan for the city, and some very interesting analysis. Back in those days, this sort of analysis that now is probably commonplace in architecture schools, or in the good ones anyway, was new. I mean, this wasn't something, people had turned their back on the historic city. That's the kind of key point. It seems strange now, maybe, but back then, a lot of architects had no time for this. They thought, let's move on. Urbino's yesterday's place. So he was saying, no, let's look at what makes it special, and let's look at how we bring it back to life. How we give it a new lease of life for the future. And I think the diagram on the right, which is looking at the relationship of Urbino to its landscape, to the vistas, the connections, the routes, is almost like a kind of force field of points of connection. I think is particularly interesting. As we move on to talk about one of the other architects in Italy at exactly the same time, who was saying some of the same things, Aldo Rossi, with his book, also of the same year, 1966, The Architecture of the City. And I think particularly Aldo Rossi's emphasis was on the buildings, on key buildings, what he called urban artifacts. And from the book, probably the most sort of arresting images are of arenas, amphitheatres, Roman structures that you can see there, and how those were taken over by the medieval city and actually became like mini cities within the city. So he was fascinated by that. And this was on the screen yesterday in Angela's group. We were talking about the Nolli map of Rome, and you can see what Rossi would have called urban artifacts, in white, the Pantheon there, other key churches and public buildings in the pattern of the city. But I think whereas Rossi put his emphasis on the urban artifacts, on the kind of architecture with a capital A, you might say, Riccardo was probably more interested in the overall pattern, the network of streets and the interlocking kind of buildings, the fabric of the city, and importantly, the activities that sustain all of that. And I think that's where it brings us on to the idea of the city as a big house. The relationship between the small elements, the houses, and the big element, the city. And I think if we go back to the Roman, a model of ancient Rome, and a plan that emphasizes the public buildings, it's almost like an extract from the Nolli plan. I mean, Nolli's plan was Rome in the 18th century. Here we're going back, 1700 years earlier to Rome at the time of Augustus. And you're seeing the public buildings there, which are huge buildings, but they incorporate external space. So they are, at one level, if you zoomed out, you could almost think of them as rooms, but when you realize they're actually very large complexes. But they form the anchors to the city, and around them are clustered the houses and all the other things that you find in the city. Just outside Rome was Hadrian's Villa. So this is about maybe 100 years later, we're talking the 2nd century. And it's almost like it's an X-ray view of Rome in a way. You imagine you've taken away all the houses and you're just left with the public buildings. And you've got this extraordinary series of spaces. This is an absolutely enormous complex. If you go there, it's really interesting. And people began to talk about it, even in those days, in Roman times, as a little city. The imperial villa, this was the home and workplace of Hadrian, the emperor. And certainly in the 20th century, as the Alberti's phrase began to be publicized, people talked about Hadrian's Villa being a house that was really a little city. And some people have compared Hadrian's Villa to Frank Lloyd Wright's Taliesin West. And I think this is a very interesting link that people have made, which it makes a lot of sense to me. The idea that the house and workplace of Wright and the apprentices, so it wasn't just a house, it was a place of work, it was a place where people lived. It was effectively like a little village, really. And it was an aggregation of different buildings clustered together with lines and paths and connections, almost like the beginning of a little city. And in his other house in Wisconsin, which I've been to, very much the same sort of feeling. It's something like a huge farmhouse, home, place of work, And the image on the right I think is particularly interesting because it shows the relationship of the house to the landscape. This kind of, the two things are enmeshed. It's almost difficult to disentangle the buildings from their surroundings. And when you go there, there is this, well, Wright used to talk about it being of the hill, not on the hill. So it was maybe a bit like today, this building has that quality of being sort of perched on the hill, but also kind of set into the hill. And Wright's plan for Broadacre City, which was a kind of a utopian vision of how countryside and city living might be brought together so you got the best of both worlds, is usually dismissed as kind of another version of utopia. It's like all cars, and perhaps people in Europe particularly would have been quite dismissive of this, saying, well, this is it's very American, but is this relevant for anyone else? But I think it's really interesting, and you can see there's a kind of grain to it, which is organised around a grid of routes and connections. But there's also extremely intricate kind of pattern within that. Where is it going to go? Go on, click. No? Why is it not? It's not advancing. Sorry, Curtis. No, I don't know what I've done this time. Oh, great. And it wasn't really anything new. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Roman system of what they called centuriation, but they essentially imposed a grid on pretty much everywhere they went. And we're all used to the idea of the Roman city, a kind of grid within a fortified wall and the two roads that cross in the middle, a forum. But actually they extended that grid, not necessarily orthogonally everywhere. It did vary in direction depending on whether it hit a river or a mountain. Some places it wasn't possible to do it. But if you look at parts of northern Italy, particularly, you see the pattern very clearly. And even today, it's still there. And I see a connection between that and this wonderful painting by Paul Klee, the Swiss artist who taught at the Bauhaus and who was contemporary of Wright and coming to Italy, and like Wright did, in fact, and sort of having his own sort of impression of the place. It's an abstraction, of course, but this was called Florentine Villa Quarter, and I think you can see there, at the beginning, you can see villas in the landscape, you can see orchards and a structure of fields and gardens, almost like, in my mind anyway, the beginnings of something, the beginnings of a city, just lying sort of hidden in the landscape. What he calls he talks about catching hold of things by their roots to see what's going on underneath. And a lovely phrase, the prehistory of the visible. And some of his paintings were explicitly about Italy. I mean, the sort of Italian city was another one. And I think if you think back to that Decavo image of the sort of lattice work of connections into the countryside, this to me has something of that quality of you can make out buildings, you can make out relationships. In fact, a little bit like the things you've been doing with looking at the pattern of streets in Urbino. And from his sketchbooks, Klee's sketchbooks, he did a lot of thinking about formation and transformation. How flowers develop and grow, how different ways of thinking about shapes, some that are very stark, objects kind of shapes, others that are shapes that make spaces that interlock. And he called the object type spaces endotopic, and the ones that are shapers of space he called exotopic. And I think those two terms are very applicable to this image from Collage City, the Colin Rowe book, where he contrasts a plan of a modern new town in France with the centre of Parma in northern Italy. And you can see how different that is. Here the buildings stand out in a kind of almost like a blank canvas. And here, yes, you do get buildings like churches, the objects, the nolly objects that we talked about earlier, but they are enmeshed in the fabric of the city. It's difficult to disengage one building from the next. It's a much more complex pattern. And if you look at architects who, from the 20th century, it seems to me that some of them, like Wright, and in this case Alvarado, were instinctively sort of tuned into that spirit. And if you look at Villa Marea, this is a sort of abstraction of how I imagine the idea evolved. So the garden, the space within the forest, the grouping of buildings, gradually building up to form this extraordinary house that was built in the late 1930s, and has that quality of growth through time. So when you go there, it's not, you find it hard to believe that it was all designed and built effectively in one go. I mean, you really do have the feeling that it's an accumulation of different things that have been added gradually. And then you could carry on adding to it, if you wanted to. You could add more buildings around the garden. You could extend it. It could even be, in a sense, the beginnings of something much larger. A villa that becomes a village. The origin of the word village, incidentally, is villa. So the villages came from large complexes, large villa complexes. And I want you to sort of contrast Villa Marais with Villa Savoie. So these are virtually contemporaries. Villa Savoie was slightly earlier. By-le Corbusier, suburb of Paris. And this is very much an endotopic object building. It's really a temple. It's not so much a house, perhaps, as a temple. And it's sitting in a glade of trees, a bit like Villa Marais. But I don't think you can really see how you could add to this. I mean, you could probably add another one next to it, but it would only detract from the quality of this extraordinary kind of temple-like quality of the original. And why does this matter? Well, I think it matters because that same way of thinking about buildings extended to the larger scale. So when Le Corbusier started thinking about social housing, that you understand in Marseille, he thought about it in much the same way. The building sits on a large site. I mean, they could have put many more buildings, and they could have done many more lower buildings. But he puts it bang in the middle of the site, and he orientates it in a kind of perfect geometry for maximum sort of solar paths, so you get good sunlight, which is a good thing, to get sunlight through the day. But his thinking is very kind of, there you go, that's it. This is the perfect building. And when you want to build a city, you just add to it. So it's kind of additive process. You take that principle and you use perfect geometries and you create a city for 2 or 3 million people, which looks a bit like a person. I don't know if you can see the heads, the almost like the centre of the body, the legs and so on. It's a kind of idealised form of city. And this was very influential after the war. Some people, I don't know if you come across these two texts, but one was Architectural Principles in the Age of Humanism, and the other one was a book, and the other one was an essay called The Mathematics of the Ideal Villa. And in both cases, the writers, Vicar and Rowe, looked back in history to the Renaissance to say, there are some principles there that we as modern architects should be using, and comparing, in this case, one of the villas with the Villa by Palladio in northern Italy, and saying, it's kind of a reinvigorated classicism, mathematical principles, proportions are what matter. Which takes us back to Alberti, who I mentioned at the start, because in Architectural Principles in the Age of Humanism, the two architects that he refers to are Palladio and Alberti. Those are the two key people. And the references were pretty much only to churches, though. So all this talk of proportions and the relationship of architecture to music was all about sacred architecture, about churches like Santa Maria la Bella in Florence. Much less about other kinds of architecture. This is a grand house in Florence by Alberti. And of course, the connection was made with ideal cities. So the panel, which you've probably seen here in Urbino on the top, this one's actually in Berlin, but it's the same thing. We don't know who painted these paintings, which seems to be strange. But they were idealised cities where nature is very much in the background. I mean, you can just about see a hill to the right. Apparently there are some pigeons here. Pigeons on there, which I can't really see. And so these were ideal, but very few of these were built. So they were influential, hugely influential as texts and images. But in reality, I mean, there are these Palmanova in northern Italy, there's an ideal town in Sicily and so on. But there are only a handful of these. And they all came after Alberti, so at least in his lifetime, none of these things were there. The sort of world that he knew was much closer to this image. So you might have something of the ideal in the foreground here, a religious painting by Piero da Francesca. But actually, in the background, look at that's a little image of Arezzo in Tuscany. And if you zoom in, it's it's recognisably Urbino. It could be Urbino, couldn't it? The wall, the hills, these sort of cascade of houses. And actually, if you take this quote from his book, on architecture and building in 10 books, he says, it's only a small town or fortification, it will be better and safe not for the streets to run straight to the gates, but to have them wind about, sometimes to the right, sometimes to the left. And it will be handsomer not to have them straight, but winding about several ways, backwards and forwards, like the course of a river. But I think that's interesting because he wasn't talking about an idealised setting. He was talking about the qualities of the towns that he knew. And that quote always reminds me of what De Carlo said in Architecture of Participation that I mentioned earlier. But perhaps the truth is too, when visiting a city, was soon bored by admiring the great avenues of order, and he turned into the side streets of disorder, alive with activities where organisational systems intertwine and forms proliferate. The truth is that order, when you think of the Plan Voisin, you saw earlier, the truth is that order corresponds to the frustrating boredom of imposition, top-down architecture designed by somebody else for you. There you go. That's yours. You know what you're getting. Whereas disorder corresponds to the exciting fantasy of participation. So the disorder of the vernacular, the kind of intricacy of Urbino that you're analysing, comes from the fact that it was built up gradually by many different people. I believe you're going to Siena shortly, and you will see this painting in the Palazzo Pubblico, well, it's a fresco. It's the Allegory of Good Government by Benedict. And this, I just think that's a terrific image of Siena in the 14th century. And you see the extraordinary kind of liveliness of the image. Contrast this with the ideal cities that we saw a second ago, which were arid, weren't they? It was a perfect perspective, but there's nothing going on. There are no people, just a couple of pigeons. There's no nature. It's just, sparks. Whereas here, the reality on the ground, captured beautifully in this picture, was more like this. And it was also making a point about ethics, because it was saying really the city is the place where there are lots of ideas. It's where people come together, and it represents the best in humanity. But it's inseparable from the countryside, and I think this is also another important lesson, that this side of the painting, which is just to the right of what we saw a second earlier, is given equal billing. It's just as important. It's literally half the painting, it's the countryside. So this connection with nature, connection with the countryside is really crucial. And it's a relationship of reciprocity, as De Carlo said. And I touched on this at the start, this relationship of Urbino to its countryside, and this sort of quality of almost impossible to separate the two things because they are reciprocals of one another. And he spoke about it being almost impossible to discern the difference. If you're flying over Urbino, you wouldn't really be able to work out where the city begins and ends. Now this brings us back to Team 10, and this idea of reciprocity and the house-city idea, which Van Eyck, the Dutch member of Team 10, one of the Dutch members, compared to the relationship of a leaf and a tree. So this is quite a famous diagram you've ever seen before, where he talks about the tree as a leaf and the leaf as a tree, and the house as a city and the city as a house. So he was really interested about how do small things relate to big things. I don't know how many people are aware of this diagram by Louis Kahn, the great American architect, who knew Van Eyck. He came to one of the early Team 10 meetings in Oxford, and he produced in the 1950s this image of where it says there to do it blurred. The plan of the city is like the plan of a house, and then he compared the living rooms to the town square, the corridor to streets, the study to the place of work, and so on. So he made an explicit connection, just like Alberti, but without ever mentioning Alberti. He made exactly the same point. And in the work of Team 10, there were some really interesting examples of how this idea was translated into buildings. So this is the famous orphanage by Van Eyck, where you see it's a very small building, but you can see that feeling of being like a little city. Another Dutch architect, Hertzberger, same sort of thing. Actually, these are, I don't know if you can tell, they're matchboxes. So they were delighting in the variety you could get out of the simple repetition of something really simple, like a matchbox in this case. And that idea translated into a very famous office building in Holland, where you can see it is like a spirit is that of a mini city, and sort of a glimpse of the inside, where you get this feeling of dense, tight spaces, the kind of spaces that you're looking at in Urbino, and the interest in that very same idea. And that idea, was influential in 1967, the famous Habitat in Montreal by Moshe. But even today, that's a project quite big, you may be familiar with. It's like a sort of contemporary hill town, or mountain dwellings. But I don't think that's quite what the camera was talking about. I think this is taking the idea and sort of going in a certain direction, but it's not quite the same direction. Because here, part and whole are absolutely tied together, like they're not really cities. They're sort of animals, perhaps, for the city. But you can see that that is very much a building, maybe inspired by the old town, but it's not really like a city. More like a city is where we are today, actually, I think. Playing with some of the same ideas. So the rooms are like houses, so each room is like a little house in a way. With where we are now, maybe the equivalent of a castle or a cathedral in the city. And the camera in Project Umbro, Project for Dublin University, actually on the left, was looking at this relationship between structure and form, between the buildings and things that link together. I'm particularly interested in what links things together. How do you avoid the separation of things that we saw in the modern city? How did you draw it together like an old city? And you may have heard of mapped buildings, that's really described the whole category of projects. It came out of these studies. That was one that was an Umbro project for Frankfurt by Shadrach Woods, an American architect, that then became basically the German idea for the university that was built in Berlin. So you can see this interest in streets and avenues and street buildings, special buildings, the lecture theatres and so on, the arenas, what's the idea. And this influenced Le Corbusier himself right at the end of his life. This unbuilt project for hospital in Venice, exactly the same sort of idea. This is a diagram from Shadrach Wood's book, which really is saying we should be doing the right, not the left. So he was saying that this is bad, association is bad, where you identify each building is separate and has their own character. What we must do is put it all together. And his idea was that the streets would be more important than the buildings. The kind of connections were more important. And it seems to me that this has an interesting relationship to something Alberti said. Alberti talked about two processes. One that we call competition, where you divide, you understand the brief. Imagine somebody's giving you a brief, and you understand what's in the brief, the different rooms, the different things that matter. And that's one part of the architect's process. And then the companion part is the chin, isn't really a translation. Nobody's managed to translate Latin into satisfactory words in English anyway. But he called it the critical sympathy. And I think it's a process of reintegration. So how do you bring those things that need to do that, understand a lecture theatre? It's a special space, and operating theatre is a special space, and a hospital. But you want both, one or the other. Both. And just a couple of examples that strike me as representing exactly that same combination of things. You've got this unbuilt house by Louis Kahn, the Golden House, and these lovely diagrams he did, where you can sort of see he's thinking about the elements of the house, he's thinking about almost like pulling it apart, what makes something, and then bringing it together. And it seems to me the courtyard in the centre, it's a bit like a cloister, central monastery, represents the collective. And the individual rooms, which read like things, are the individuals. So he's kind of taking the individual bits and he's bringing them together around a collective idea. And it becomes a society of rooms, which I think is a really nice phrase. And if you look at Alvarado, this building from Germany, cultural centre in Wolfsburg, library and lecture theatres and so on, exactly the same idea. In fact, you can see these kind of diagonals, this pulling and pushing of elements. And on a smaller scale, this famous town hall in San Janslo, which is like a little hill town. It's like a miniature little sort of microcosm of the town, where the individual elements are legible. You see the meeting chamber for the council on floor 1 here. You can read it externally. You've got a library building that's kind of connected but separate. You've got offices, even some flats, organised around a kind of urban idea. So sort of summing up, before I go into the final place of the talk, what have we sort of learned so far? Well, this idea of the relationship of the small and the big, the house and the city, in the words of Alvin van Eyck, really was symbolic of approaching architecture urbanistically, not as an isolated thing, and thinking about urbanism architecturally. So let's not have separate professions, let's not have a bunch of economists and geographers and town planners telling us, or property developers telling us how the city should be, and architects over here designing museums and expensive houses for rich people. Let's bring architects and urbanists and everybody together to think with the people who live in the city, and let's all think holistically, sustainably about design. And Bruno Zevi, a really important architectural historian, contemporary time, said in the 60s, there's no such thing as architecture or urbanism, only urbitecture. Well, urbitettura in Italian, which I've translated as urbitecture, which I think is a really interesting idea. So, trying to draw some of these strands together, the idea of compartition, sort of dividing up the breeds, I think is a little bit about, like thinking about the city in terms of its houses. I don't just mean literary houses, I mean the buildings that make up the city. Very much in line with what Alberti said. And I think that's just the same as Louis Kahn saying architecture stems from making a room. You've got to start somewhere, and then this is a beautiful room to think about. What does a room like? And what's special simply because it's electric, it's got a very particular quality to it. There's probably couldn't be used for anything else. It's a classic example of a specialised kind of room. And Emil Saarinen, Finnish architect, he was a sort of generation before Aalto, said, man belongs to the realm of creation and is subject to the principle of expression. And so I see something very similar to Alberti, and he had one part of the process with expression in his terms, and his equivalent to Chinitas was what he called correlation. So correlation is that kind of drawing together around the idea of the city, which I think we can call discovering what the building wants to be. So you've got the idea, you know what the building's made of, you know the elements, but how does it come together? The prehistory of the visible, we learned about earlier from Paul. The principle of correlation, bringing everything together. And if you are in an existing context, like a city, you've got certain clues. You've got a collective structure. That's part of the answer, it seems to me. So if you've got these two poles, the house and the city, at the scale of the house, you've got rooms, but at the scale of the city, you have buildings. And rooms and buildings are really two, almost the same thing, in a way, in Alberti's terms. Why don't you think about rooms as miniature buildings? And the house is symbolic of the family, the individual, smaller scale. But at the scale of the city, it's the society. Society is made up of individuals, made up of families, it's a kind of scalable thing. Memory, you need people to have memories, and memories is something that I think are current, are memories to people. But when you add them all together, and you add architecture and the past and the literature and all of the kind of records of memory and times past, you get culture. At the level of architecture and the individual components of the city, you have forms, but the city gives a structure, because there's always something there that was there before. And I think the countryside itself, nature gives a structure, because you have hills, you have topography, you have streams, you have ancient paths, Broadway in New York, and so on. There's always something, either coming from man or coming from nature. The house is about self-expression, at least in the days when people built their own houses, and the city is about how those things come together in a collective correlation of those expressions. And I think, this is me speaking, when De Carlo was talking about participation, he was really talking about involving people, involving the individual, having conversations like we're having today. And when he was talking about the city, that's where reading comes in. And participation in reading is sort of twin processes. They go together. You do both. If you have a strong context, then you can lean more heavily on reading because there's a lot of clues in the place. If you've got a weak context with a group of people, as you always will if you're designing something, you can lean more heavily on participation. So just to end, I thought I wanted to show a few images of projects which, where I've, my work, have sort of thought about some of the same things. And to me, they're all micro-cities, what I call micro-cities, all micro-cities, whether they're for living, learning, or health. And this idea of rooms as little buildings was starting to become a school of education. I mean, there are lots of ways that you could look at this building, and you must go and see it before you go. Because it sort of encapsulates many of the themes that were of interest to him. But I think what I loved about it, as soon as I saw it, its sort of plan, was this legibility of the elements within it. You remember what this perimeter wall that existed, and this building existed, which I think is very well known. And it's like he took a lecture of it and inserted it, so he found insertions inside the existing fabric. So he preserved the structure of the city, but he played with this idea and created a city within a city. So when we move around in here, we have a sort of analogue of the spaces of the city. And you have this kind of vertical piazza, so that the form of the lecture is a collective form. It's absolutely about getting together meeting by its very shape. But then when you go up to the top, you have this extraordinary relationship to the landscape. So in my own work, I went to school from some years ago, I'm very interested in this idea of rooms as buildings within the complex, as if you're in a city. And this was a secondary school in southern England, and you can see the sort of essence of the idea here with the curved classroom wings, a theatre, a gymnasium, a library, and then a multi-purpose space in the middle, which we actually called Arena, and it was the idea that you could bring the whole school together for assemblies. And before you go in, there's a little town square. The library is accessible by people who live in the community, so it's a multi-purpose room in that sense. And you have this, there are no corridors as such, everybody circulates on balconies, so you move around the building, you always other people. So it's really almost an urban experience, I would say. You can see this image of when they have assembly 3 times a week. You can open the theatre, you can have some people actually sitting inside the theatre and looking out. You could have a performance if you wanted in the round. But you can bring, there's about 1,500 people together 3 times a week so like a town square. The sort of second theme was buildings as landscape. I'm sure you stood here. Extraordinary green roofs, the building stepping down the hill. I'm not sure if you're on the hill or on the building. And in some of the kind of other projects in a sort of very poetic vein, he explored rolling forms, sports centre in Siena, partially built, which I've been very interested in the way the lie of the land, the way the building adapts to the landscape. I did a project for Children's Hospital a few years ago in Liverpool. We worked with very much the same idea and were particularly interested in the relationship of the building to the park. So this was the hospital as we found it. It was a large, famous children's hospital in Liverpool. And it's just more like a factory than you've got all these buildings, but it doesn't feel like a town. It felt very uninviting. There was just one long corridor up here, and it took you, I don't know, 6, 7, 10 minutes to go. It's actually sloping up. It's like this incredibly institutional building, and they couldn't go into the park because there was no access to the park. So the new building, which was developed in one hit, was really the idea that you replace the whole hospital thing, make a strong connection with the park, and then demolish the existing hospital and gradually replace it with other buildings around the edges. And you get this immediacy of relationship to the park. Everybody's close to the ground. So the bedrooms and the wards at the top were close to the ground, close to nature, sort of the human scale. And also lots of kind of connections between the different elements of the building. So there are parts of the building on the ground here. So you're not quite sure, a bit like the Carlos, the project we saw earlier, you're not quite sure what's natural and what's man-made. But wherever you are, you've got views, you've got light, you've got connections between people. And at the centre of the hospital, a street that runs from the main entrance in the foreground here through to a secondary entrance and on into the park and the future phases of the hospital. So in the middle, you bring together all those functions, collective functions, in a town-like way in the heart of the hospital that also makes wayfinding really easy. You never get lost. It's absolutely simple. There are only 2 banks of lifts. You bring together staff. They can have meetings, lectures. It's all happening in one space. Descartes spoke about the simulation of slow growth, and he was interested in how things change over time. And I think you can see that everywhere, of course, in Italy. This layering. And this is actually a hospital in Siena, the facade, which is a building that Descartes studied with Ilaud. And you can see how many interventions over time have taken place there, which is an extraordinary kind of tapestry of different interventions. But I think here in the College of the Colli, you have something of that feeling. I mean, it was built in one go in the late 60s, but it has that sense that it's been there longer. It could be added to, maybe, and it'd be very interesting to see how it could be added to, perhaps. But it's got that quality of a hill town. And it was very much inspiration for me doing the first hospital I did in Cork, just outside Cork in Ireland, which was a residential hospital for the elderly, so people are here long term, on a hillside, with some beautiful existing trees that we wanted to keep. And we designed it as a village, really. And it had, because it was for an order of nuns, there was a chapel, there's a restaurant, there are shared communal facilities, a village green, and a series of houses making up clusters of bedrooms, each one with their own sort of communal space. And it formed a kind of little village on the hill. And what I was very pleased about is that some years later, another firm of architects, without us being involved in any way at all, added to it. They expanded it quite considerably. And I'll show you some images of what they did. I mean, this is the original village green, and sometimes you can see the chapel in the background. This was the view from the south. The whole thing opens up to the valley, opens up to the view, a bit like here, an extraordinary view. And this is actually the part of the new, where they added on. And I think they did it very sensitively, but I think it was tribute to us as the original architects, if I can say that, because we gave them the clues. We created something that had a kind of language to it, so that if you were sensitive to that language, you could come along and you could add another house, or 2 houses, or 4 houses, just like a town in time grows. And I was delighted. I saw nothing of this until they'd finished, and I was delighted to see the result. And this is actually the expanded village. You can't really, even though I worked on the original scheme, I'm barely aware of what they did. They made the restaurant bigger here. They added houses in the background there. And yet I think the result is delightful. It's really sort of picked up on the grain, on the structure of the original village. Another example of growth, or slow growth, is a project we're doing at the moment for Great Ormond Street, Britain's most famous children's hospital in London. This was the competition scheme, and it was about houses and gardens. We had the idea of creating the new building out of what we call 4 houses. Between the houses were shared spaces and also a main entrance. And you can see here an upper level with the gardens. The gardens are actually inside, but between the houses. And these are the bedrooms organised around the staff facilities in the middle. So there's a kind of little heart space to each cluster of bedrooms. So taking a typical ward, which would be 24, 28 or maybe 30 bedrooms, breaking them down into smaller scale elements, so there was a more friendly, family-friendly kind of atmosphere. But that project was too big, it was too expensive, and they also didn't want to demolish this building in the end. So they asked us to develop a new scheme, and we did. But we didn't throw the concept out. We actually thought, well, how could we do this with the same idea of houses, but fewer houses, and sort of reinterpreted, so the shape is different, but the essence of the idea is still there. And I think this notion of a strong idea, you might call it the urban idea, forming the backbone of a project. So as you go through years of dialogue, and I mean we've been working on this 6 years, And we hope to get planning permission in December, and we hope to start building it in about a year's time. So it just gives you a sense of how long these things take. But to have the essence of an idea that you can hold on to, but is still flexible, just like a city is flexible. So there is a city idea, there's a house, city, garden idea here, which tries to take the scale of a very big building, and this is the rest of the hospital campus in the background, and break it down into smaller elements, house-like elements, with balconies and gardens and external spaces in between, so that you have a kind of scaling device. And you can see this is the kind of elevation to the street, how it might work, with a rooftop garden at the top, all the way along at the top. There's a roof garden for everybody. And you can see how it sits in the street. These are very sensitive. These are actually 17th and 18th century houses here. So we're near the end. The idea of architecture, we saw Nolly's plan earlier. But this is a plan of Dublin, kind of in the same vein, where you can see sort of public buildings in black. And you can see these tremendous, this is Georgian Dublin, so we're in the 18th, maybe early 19th century. And you see these set-piece town squares, which are absolutely fabulous. This is all now built out, but the city has filled in around them. But then you can see how these were put down before the buildings. You know, somebody had this idea of these great civic spaces. And we were given a site for the new children's hospital, which is absolutely huge, which is here. And it's opposite Ireland's first hospital, 17th century hospital, absolutely beautiful building. And I'll show you an image of that now, which is actually here. It's called Kilmainham, and it's now the Museum of Modern Art. It's absolutely wonderful. It has this amazing garden, botanic garden, where they would grow the medicines, basically, the herbs and the medicines relations. But if you were over here on this big hospital site, this is Nanold Hospital that has been there for many years, you're walking around, you had no idea that was there. You're kind of lost in a tangle of utilitarian buildings, as you normally are in a hospital. And they set us a goal of designing the finest children's hospital in the world. And it's absolutely huge. It's 160,000 square meters, which is something like, well, it's not far off 2 million square feet in area, to give you an idea. And it's got about nearly 500 bedrooms and so on and so forth. It's enormous. So the challenge was absolutely one of scale. You know, how do you do it? And I think the urban idea here was very strong right from the beginning. Creating a street through the middle. It's a windy street, so it's not actually a straight line for all sorts of reasons, partly just getting it to fit on the side, but working with the geometry of the side. There's a new kind of piazza at the front door, a north entrance here too, room for expansion so the street could carry on and connect maybe in the future to this road. But it's also a series of buildings within the building, looking at this, the outpatient departments, and picking up where we could on the grain of these much smaller houses in the foreground. You know, these streets almost feel like they carry on into the garden courtyards in our building. And you can see how many, there are 5,500 rooms in this building. And there's probably a population during the day of 4,000 to 5,000 people coming here, working and patients, families, and other people coming. It's also a research hospital, and it has a school of medicine. So it's also the place of where people are taught. So you've got everything here. You've got living, you've got teaching, you've got research. There's a restaurant. It is literally a city in that sense. But we looked at, in a sense, we used the same technique as Nolly to think about public, private, semi-public, the gradation of spaces, in yellow, the very public, so the central's fine. But also continuing that matrix into the departments. So once we've defined the overall structure, we could allow these to develop internally with the users over a long span of time. We worked with them for years, literally hundreds of workshops to define the detail within the different elements. And for me, breaking it up into component parts, this is actually the lecture bit. It's a space larger than this, but inside here, with a medical library on top. That piece is like a building inside the building, and we could carry on refining and developing that without changing the dialogue that we were having with a completely separate group of people about another part of the building. And at the heart, there's this extraordinary garden space. You're actually halfway up the building here, so not unlike the kind of playing with the rebels in the city. You're actually on the 4th floor, but you wouldn't know it. So you're breaking down the scale. If you're in the wards, you think you're in a 3-story high building. And look, from a cityscape point of view, we've masked the bulk of this enormous building. So that these lower elements relate to the scale of the houses around there. We have roof gardens sort of terracing up from the street level all the way to the roof. And just so you know, it's real. This is an image about 2 months ago. So it should open, all being well, in 2 years' time, after 10 years of work. So finally, just a final wrap-up, really, and coming back to the cover, really give him the final word. I think this notion of reciprocity between part and whole is probably the essence of the urbitecture idea, the house in the city, the individual in society, the whole idea of reading and participation. The backdrop is one of this lovely project in Venice. He spoke of an articulated architecture in the form of concretions or agglomerations, where the meanings of part and whole are in a constant and changing relationship of reciprocity, which I think is like an ecosystem. He didn't use the word sustainability, because nobody did in those days, and he didn't talk about, well, he sometimes talked about ecosystems, but I think it's very much that idea of an ecology of places and people being part of that ecology. And this was one of his final projects for Hamlet in northern Italy, which was completely fallen into disuse and was brought back to life as a community for well-heeled tourists, I suppose. But nevertheless, it was brought from complete ruin back into a living place. And I think the cover was very struck by the extraordinary quality of the spaces. But I think in the end, the important thing as architects is to improve the material conditions of those for whom we build. And it is about facilitating the human need to communicate through self-representation. So the idea of communication, and we talked about that yesterday, I think is a central part of what we do. If you are an architect that does things in isolation, I've had a dream, and you kind of put down a piece of paper, and then you go, there, it's done. That's not engaging with people. That's not helping them to communicate. It's not creating a dialogue. And I think what he was interested in is richness and diversity of architecture, something that has a certain degree of complexity in it that allows you to add to it. And it would be fascinating to think about adding to this campus. What would you do? And I think it offers lots of points of, for us, things that, starting points for us to think about if we were to add to it. And I think above all, promoting diversity, not the kind of monoculture of city centres that we saw earlier. That's it.